Writing a melody as timeless and moving as the Beatles' Yesterday isn't something most of us would consider a problem. But in the mid-1960s, that's precisely what that song was for the Fab Four. By 1965, the Beatles were already transforming popular music at a pace few artists could match. Every new single seemed to redefine what a rock band could achieve, and every album pushed them a little further away from the straightforward rock and roll that had launched their careers. Yet even in a catalog filled with innovation, Yesterday represented something entirely different. It was not merely another experimental step forward. It was a song that seemed to belong to an entirely different musical world. Although the song is credited to the Lennon-McCartney partnership and billed as the Beatles, as was the creed of the day per producer George Martin in Anthology, Yesterday was solely a Paul McCartney composition. The melody came to him in a dream, he came up with the lyrics, and he's the only Beatle performing on the album version. The story behind its creation has since become one of the most famous songwriting tales in music history. McCartney famously woke up with the melody fully formed in his head and rushed to a piano to make sure he wouldn't forget it. Convinced he must have unconsciously borrowed it from somewhere else, he spent weeks playing it to friends, musicians, and industry figures, asking whether they recognized it. To his amazement, nobody did. For a long time, the song existed under the placeholder title Scrambled Eggs, complete with humorous temporary lyrics. McCartney continued refining the composition, gradually realizing that the melody was indeed his own creation. What emerged was a remarkably mature piece of songwriting, one filled with longing, regret, and emotional vulnerability. It was a stark contrast to many of the upbeat love songs that had characterized the Beatles' early years. Therein was the problem. The Beatles were a rock band, and Yesterday didn't have rock and roll or a band to speak of. Speaking to PBS, Martin recalled the song presented a problem for me, and I think for the Beatles too, in that it didn't fit the pattern. It wasn't a song you could do with two guitars, bass guitar, and drums. It was something much more delicate. That observation struck at the heart of the dilemma. The Beatles had built their reputation as a four-piece group whose chemistry was their greatest strength. Even as their music became more sophisticated, the dynamic interaction between John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr remained central to their identity. Yesterday, however, seemed to resist that formula at every turn. There was no obvious role for a driving drum pattern. There was no place for Harrison's lead guitar flourishes. John Lennon's rhythm guitar and vocal harmonies, normally essential ingredients in a Beatles recording, felt unnecessary. The song's emotional power came from its intimacy, and adding conventional band arrangements risked overwhelming what made it special. So, Martin set out to do the most important producer job of all, getting the roadblock out of the way. One of George Martin's greatest talents was recognizing what a song needed rather than forcing it into an existing formula. Many producers might have attempted to reshape Yesterday into something that sounded more like a typical Beatles track. Martin, instead, realized that the song itself was dictating its own arrangement. Rather than asking how the band could fit into the song, he asked what arrangement would best serve the composition. That distinction proved crucial. Martin understood that preserving the song's delicate, emotional atmosphere was more important than maintaining traditional expectations about what a Beatles recording should sound like. So both the band and producer George Martin reached a consensus that Yesterday ought to be performed solely by Paul McCartney. There was nothing that George Harrison, John Lennon, and Ringo Starr could think to contribute, and they preferred to sit out instead of muddying the song's potential. It was Martin who suggested they bring in strings, though McCartney had his hesitations. The decision was unusual and, in some respects, risky. At the time, Beatles records were expected to showcase all four members. Presenting a track that effectively functioned as a solo performance could easily have caused tension or confusion. Yet the band demonstrated remarkable artistic maturity by putting the song first. Lennon, Harrison, and Starr recognized that forcing their presence onto the recording would not necessarily improve it. Their willingness to step aside illustrated a quality that often gets overlooked when discussing the Beatles. Despite their enormous individual talents, They were capable of making collective decisions that benefited the music above all else. Paul said, "I don't want Mantovani," Martin said via Anthology. I said, "What about a very small number of string players, a quartet?" He thought that was interesting, and I went and worked on it with him and made suggestions for the score. He had ideas too, and we booked a string quartet and overdubbed the strings, and that was the record. McCartney's concern was understandable. During the era, lush orchestral arrangements often carried associations with easy listening music and overly sentimental pop productions. The last thing he wanted was for Yesterday to sound overly polished or drenched in syrupy orchestration. Martin's suggestion of a string quartet offered a perfect compromise. Instead of overwhelming the song, the strings would complement its melancholy mood while preserving its intimacy. The arrangement added elegance and emotional depth without sacrificing the directness of McCartney's vocal performance. What resulted was revolutionary in its simplicity. The quartet did not dominate the recording, it quietly enhanced it. Every note seemed carefully chosen, serving the song rather than drawing attention to itself. As McCartney would add, some of those ideas Martin spoke of were direct contradictions to what the producer said. He would demonstrate proper harmony to McCartney, who McCartney would immediately do the opposite. "I remember suggesting the seventh that appears on the cello," McCartney said. George said, "You definitely wouldn't have that in there. That would be very un-string quartet." I said, "Well, whack it in, George. I've got to have it." That exchange perfectly captured the creative tension that often produced the Beatles' greatest work. Martin possessed extensive classical training and deep knowledge of traditional arranging techniques. McCartney, meanwhile, relied heavily on instinct, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge convention. In many cases, innovation emerged precisely because neither side completely yielded to the other. Martin provided structure and expertise. McCartney supplied imagination and fearlessness. The famous cello note became a small but telling example of how the Beatles frequently achieved originality, not by following established rules, but by questioning them. When the rest of the band heard the final playback of Yesterday, John Lennon applauded that same seventh in the cello that McCartney fought to keep in. And in that way, the spirit of the Beatles remained present in Yesterday, even though they weren't physically there. That moment is perhaps the most revealing aspect of the song's story. On paper, Yesterday appears to be the least Beatles-like Beatles recording imaginable. It features only one member of the band, no drums, no electric guitars, and a classical string quartet. Yet its creation embodied everything that made the Beatles extraordinary. It reflected their openness to experimentation, their refusal to be constrained by expectations, and their commitment to serving the song above all else. Even in their absence, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr contributed through their support and willingness to embrace something unconventional. The irony is that the song that once seemed like a problem became one of the most beloved recordings in popular music history. Yesterday has been covered thousands of times, translated into countless musical styles, and embraced by generations of listeners around the world. What initially appeared to be an obstacle for the Beatles ultimately became one of their defining achievements. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs occur when artists stop trying to fit a masterpiece into an existing mold and instead allow it to become exactly what it was meant to be. For the Beatles, that lesson arrived in the form of a dream-born melody called Yesterday.